there a grain, a cask type, or other element that I want to experiment with in the future?
One of the things I'd like to experiment with over time into the future in Scotch whisky is continuous distillation and working with different types of cereals, working with running the stills in different sorts of ways. Pretty much everybody runs them, operates in this kind of the same way today, and I'd like to look at doing things differently with continuous distillation in the future. Geeky, but that's something I'm interested in.
We have no fear of experimenting. Maybe we don't do it every day, but we're constantly experimenting. Is there stuff that we want to play with in the future? Absolutely. We're working with different grains, we're working with different cask types, we're working with different proofing liquids. We're working with every aspect of the whiskey making process. We're not really experimenting and innovating in order to try to create gimmicky products. We want people to be as excited about whiskey as we are.
We've been experimenting for a couple of years with Islay grown rye and distilling that here at a very, very small scale, but learning a bit more about that. But that's kind of a live experiment, I suppose. It's really interesting to see the difference in flavours that we're able to distill through, a traditional Victorian distillery with a very, very different type of grain. As an example, that's really good because we start thinking about the different casks that we're using, that some in this warehouse here actually, how that shapes the spirit. It's not like you're going to learn something very, very quickly. It's over a long, long time. But rye is something that's really interesting again because it's grown on Islay, because it's a rotational crop. It helps the soil, it helps the farmers. Again, that holistic approach to making whiskey. It's not just thinking about one aspect. It's thinking about the community. It's thinking about the growers. It's thinking about the sustainability aspect of making whiskey as well. So that's certainly taking up a lot of our time just now. Some interesting things we have up our sleeves. I've got enough on my plate just now without trying to think of too many more ideas, but you rest assured there's always going to be new things from Brooklyn. We'll always be thinking of something.
Peats or alternatives to peat. The peat that we use in Highland Park is very light, fragrant, because it's produced over the millennia with low-growing shrubs. It's a very aromatic character. We had an experimentation with farmers in Orkney, and farmers who weren't traditionally barley farmers, and getting them to grow a new variety of barley called tartan. So this was an experiment for farmers. They weren't used to doing it. It was an experiment for us. So we took this in over a period of 6-7 years, tiny volumes, produced less than a week's worth of mash. But when we malted it, used Orkney peat to dry it, gave a completely different character from our normal malting. We would normally say that the grain doesn't make much of a difference, but in that case it did. It was a much more ashy, dry, burnt character. I've used a tiny volume of that. We still have all the whiskey produced by tartan barley maturing, and at some point in the future I'll use some of that, or use all of it for a release.
I have had this barrel that I fell in love with in Scotland. It's a Massandra cask. It's out at Glenglassaugh. George Garvin Brown, the founder of Old Forester, of Brown-Forman, is of Scottish heritage. That's why we always spell Old Forester without an E in our whiskey. I've always wanted to do an Old Forester that was finished in a post-use Scotch barrel, and that Massandra cask is so old. The wood is just smooth. It's what I imagine a pirate ship would feel like on the outside. I don't know that I'll ever have access to a pirate ship, but if I did, it would feel like the Massandra cask. So you never know. Maybe I'll get my cask one day, maybe I won't, but that's the one I want.
There are many grains and many cask types, many things that I both am and want to experiment with in the future, but it's a secret, of course.